The book of Exodus opens with a people thriving, a family grown to a nation amidst foreign soil. Genesis tells of Jacob and his sons descending into Egypt. Seeking refuge from famine, they found favor and settled in the land of Goshen, prospering greatly. But as generations passed, a new dynasty arose in Egypt, one that did not know Joseph. And fearing the growing Israelite population, they enslaved them, imposing brutal labor. How can we ascertain the historical reality of this profound narrative? A story of both astounding growth and oppressive bondage. Faith and Facts embarks on an investigative journey, uncovering artifacts and archaeological sites that speak volumes about this critical period in ancient history. We seek evidence to validate the text, see if the Scripture's account of Israel's multiplication and subsequent oppression finds echoes in the dust of ancient Sequil, and the dust of ancient Sequil that speak volumes of Makant. The geographic stage for Israel's early presence, a land of rich soil and strategic importance, bordered by the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the vast Sinai Peninsula to the east. This region was a crucible of cultures connecting Egypt with the Levant through ancient trade routes and migration pathways, particularly along the eastern arm of the Nile. Modern archaeological excavations at Tel el-Daba, the site of the ancient cities of Avaris and later Pi-Ramesses, provide a direct window into the period of Israelite presence and the dynamic political landscape. To understand the narrative of Israel's multiplication in Egypt, we must first anchor ourselves in the broad sweep of history. The story of the Israelites unfolding in Egypt during the late Second Intermediate Period and New Kingdom falls, approximately between the 18th and 13th centuries BC. A time when Egypt was experiencing significant foreign influence and internal power shifts. Simultaneously, across the ancient world, Mesopotamian kingdoms were navigating their own complex politics. Greece was entering its Mycenaean age, and the Hittite Empire was reaching its zenith in Anatolia. Tracing the biblical timeline macroscopically from Adam through Abraham's covenant, through the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt, and projecting forward through the Exodus, the exile, and eventually to the coming of Jesus Christ and the modern era, reveals an extraordinary continuity and a vast historical canvas upon which these events are painted. The Scripture tells us that the descendants of Jacob, who came to Egypt as a small family unit, grew exponentially. So numerous, they became a source of anxiety for the Egyptian rulers. So great was their population that Pharaoh, fearing an Israelite uprising or a potential alliance with Egypt's enemies, decreed their enslavement, forcing them to build store cities like Pithom and Ramesses under the cruelest conditions. The narrative continues with the birth of Moses, his rescue from the Nile, and his eventual return to deliver his people from their oppression. This period of growth and hardship is central to the Israelite identity, a foundational story of redemption from slavery. Hyksos Scarab. The archaeological record from Egypt provides compelling glimpses into the presence of foreign peoples within the Nile Delta during the period when Israel's growth is narrated in the biblical texts. The story of Israel's multiplication in Egypt is intrinsically linked to a period of significant foreign domination and cultural interchange within Egypt itself. Specifically, the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1700 to 1550 BC, saw the rise of the Hyksos, a group of West Asian origins who established control over Lower Egypt and established their capital at Avaris. The presence of foreign rulers and a substantial foreign population in this region created a unique environment where immigrant groups, such as the progenitors of Israel, could establish themselves and multiply without necessarily attracting the overwhelming attention of the Theban rulers in Upper Egypt, who were struggling to regain full control. The Hyksos brought with them new military technology, such as the chariot and the composite bow, and introduced new cultural elements, significantly altering the Egyptian landscape. The very nature of Hyksos rule, which was essentially a foreign empire within Egypt, provides a historical context where a growing group of Asiatic peoples could indeed thrive and multiply, unnoticed or unperturbed by the core Egyptian power structure until a later period. The Hyksos Scarab. Artifacts bearing inscriptions and seals typical of this period are found in abundance at sites associated with their rule, indicating a substantial foreign presence and administrative presence within the Nile Delta. These scarabs served as amulets, seals, and markers of officialty, their distribution offering insights into the extent of Hyksos' influence and the populations living under their governance. Minimalist and maximalist. Academics remain divided on the precise chronology of the Israelite presence relative to the Hyksos period. However, the lack of direct mention of Israel in most Egyptian records until much later periods suggests that their early growth may have occurred during times of transient foreign rule or internal Egyptian instability, periods where external observation of growing immigrant groups was limited. The Hyksos period was characterized by a significant presence of people from Western Asia, creating a cultural and demographic environment that could accommodate and facilitate the growth of other Semitic groups. The discovery of numerous Hyksos scarabs provides tangible evidence of this foreign presence and the administrative systems in place, offering a glimpse into the context within which the biblical narrative of Israel's rapid population growth may have taken root. Waiting. The evidence goes deeper. How can we possibly verify the details of this immigration and establishment from the perspective of the immigrants themselves? Brooklyn Papyrus 35.1446. The Brooklyn Papyrus, specifically designated as Papyrus 35.1446, offers a remarkable and often overlooked piece of evidence that directly corroborates the biblical account of Semitic peoples living and working in Egypt during a relevant historical period. This ancient text, translated and studied by Egyptologists, is an administrative document detailing the distribution of supplies and allocations of labor, primarily focusing on servants and laborers. What makes this papyrus particularly significant is its explicit mention of individuals with clearly Semitic names, including names that resemble those found within the biblical narrative of Israelite slavery. These are not the names of high officials or royalty, but rather of ordinary workers, providing a ground-level view of the labor force available to Egyptian authorities. The papyrus lists names such as Asher, Issachar, and Enoch, names which echo through the genealogies and histories of the Israelite people as described in the Hebrew Bible. Scholars suggest that the date of the Brooklyn Papyrus, placed roughly in the Middle Kingdom or early Second Intermediate period, circa 1850–1650 BC, aligns with the biblical timeline for the Israelites' arrival and establishment in Egypt. This document, therefore, provides contemporary Egyptian evidence for the presence and utilization of individuals with Semitic names within the Egyptian labor system, offering a textual corroboration for the very concept of a significant Semitic population residing and engaged in labor within Egypt. It is important to note that the papyrus does not explicitly identify these individuals as Israelites in the biblical sense. However, the presence of such names within an administrative document concerning laborers during a period when Semitic immigration into Egypt was well documented is highly significant. Historians argue over the precise interpretation of these names and their link to specific biblical tribes. Yet, the fact of Semitic laborers being recorded in Egyptian administrative documents is undeniable. This provides a crucial piece of external evidence that supports the scriptural assertion of Israelites being present in Egypt in numbers sufficient to be registered as part of the labor force. The Brooklyn Papyrus acts as a vital bridge, connecting the theological narrative of Scripture with the tangible records of the ancient world, lending credibility to the stories of Israel's sojourn and growing presence. If you are finding this investigation compelling, consider leaving a comment below with your thoughts on historical evidence. Tel El Daba Avaris, Pyramuses. The extensive archaeological excavations at Tel El Daba in the Nile Delta have unearthed layers of history that directly illuminate the biblical account of Israel's presence and multiplication in Egypt. This vast site, identified by archaeologists as the location of the ancient Hyksos capital of Avaris, and later as the new kingdom city of Pyramuses, was strategically situated in the region of Goshen, the very area where Scripture states the Israelites settled. The archaeological evidence reveals a gradual shift in population and architecture over centuries, indicating periods of foreign presence and significant settlement. Dating of the strata at Tel El Dabba presents a complex picture. Scholars argue regarding the exact timing of the earliest Semitic occupation and its scant continuation through various dynastic periods. However, the presence of distinct West Asian architectural styles, pottery, and burial practices from as early as the Middle Kingdom, and particularly during the Hyksos period, indicates a substantial and long-standing foreign population in this part of Egypt. The later layers of the site, associated with the New Kingdom and the Ramesside periods, reveal the construction of large-scale public works, including palaces and temples. WHICH Egyptian records attribute to pharaohs like Ramesses II. The biblical narrative states the Israelites were forced to build store cities like Ramesses. The identification of Tel El Dabba as the location of both Avaris and Pyrameses, the capital city associated with the pharaoh of the Exodus, provides a geographical and architectural anchor for the biblical account. The sheer scale of the city and its infrastructure suggests a large labor force was required for its construction and maintenance, a requirement met by both Egyptian and foreign laborers. Studies of the remains at Tel El Dabba have revealed evidence of multiple cultural groups coexisting and interacting, including indigenous Egyptians and immigrants from the Levant. Some archaeologists and historians have sought to identify specific evidence of Israelite presence within the layers of Tel El Dabba, such as distinct settlement patterns or artifacts that might indicate a northern Israelite population. However, the evidence is often interpreted differently by minimalist and maximalist academics, with debates continuing over the presence of a distinct Israelite quarter or their specific role in the city's development. Nevertheless, the site's strategic location in the Nile Delta, its history as a center of foreign influence and administration, and its connection to the Ramesside dynasty provide a powerful archaeological context for the biblical stories of Israel's multiplication and enslavement. The physical remains at Tel El Dabba, when viewed in conjunction with other Egyptian records, offer a persistent and compelling case for the historical reality of a significant Semitic population residing and working in this region of Egypt during the period leading up to the Exodus. We urge you to like this video if you appreciate the rigorous approach to examining ancient historical claims. The evidence collectively builds a compelling case for the historical reality of Israel's multiplication in Egypt. The Hyksos scarabs indicate a period of significant foreign presence and administration in the Nile Delta, creating an environment where immigrant groups could thrive. The Brooklyn Papyrus provides a unique textual corroboration, detailing the presence and utilization of individuals with Semitic names within Egyptian labor systems, echoing the scriptural account of Israelite bondage. Finally, the archaeological investigations at Tel El Dabba, the site of Avaris and Pyrameses, uncovered physical evidence of foreign settlement and grand-scale construction projects in the region, identified as Goshen, directly aligning with the biblical geography and the narrative of forced labor. While scholarly debates persist regarding precise chronologies and interpretations, the convergence of these three distinct lines of evidence, archaeological artifacts, ancient texts, and strategic locations strongly supports the historical framework of Israel's rapid growth and subsequent oppression in ancient Egypt. This investigation demonstrates that the biblical narrative is not an isolated myth, but is embedded within a rich and verifiable historical context, offering profound insights into the formation of a nation. We invite you to subscribe to Faith and Facts for continued exploration of historical and faith-based questions.